Hey everybody, this is Dr. Everson bringing to you a short lecture on the book of Deuteronomy. We talked briefly before about the meaning of the word Deuteronomy. It comes from the Greek adjective deuteros, which means second, and the Greek noun nomos, which means law, and so deuteronomos refers to a second law. And there's a bit of new information for me reading through the textbook with you this week. Your textbook begins, the name of this book of the Bible comes from a Greek compound that means second law, which I just said. Ironically, it derives from a misunderstanding in the Septuagint of a Hebrew phrase in Deuteronomy 17:18, where the king is instructed to make a copy of this law. Although the title of the book rests on a mistranslation in the Septuagint, it is nevertheless a fortuitous error, since Deuteronomy contains a second version of the law, derived on Mount Sinai, as recorded in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. So anyway, I guess I hadn't realized that the actual tomb Deuteronomos shows up in the Septuagint of Deuteronomy 17:18. Although they're saying that's a misnomer, still I enjoy the additional biblical trivia. Moving on, the book of Deuteronomy, which means second law, is basically a series of addresses or speeches that are given by Moses. You can almost view them as the farewell speeches of Moses. They're on the plains of Moab. They're about to enter into the promised land, and Moses is sort of setting things in order with the Israelites, giving them his final instructions before they enter into the promised land. So it's full of rhetorical. It's full of rhetoric. It's very thoughtful. It's packed with theology. Deuteronomy is quite different than the book of Numbers, as we were just looking at last week. So, anywho, there's a start for Deuteronomy. Historical background. So, when we're talking about the historical background, why not jump right into 2 Kings chapter 22? This is what liberal scholarship usually does when they describe the book of Deuteronomy. Your textbook does this as well. If you look in the 22nd chapter of 2 Kings, and I'll start at verse 8 here, the text reads, Then Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, who read it. And I'll skip down here to verse 11. The book of the law that was found was eventually given to Josiah, and the text reads down in verse 11, When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. Then the king commanded Hilkiah the priest, skip down here, Go inquire of the Lord for me and the people and all Judah concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that burns against us, because our fathers have not listened to the words of this book, to do according to all that is written concerning us. So Josiah, as renovations are being made on the temple, comes upon this book of Deuteronomy. It's brought to him. It's read to him. And he's convicted because they're not living up to the expectations that are found in the book of Deuteronomy. And so he seeks to institute some reforms. Now, if you look on 105 and 106 of your textbook, they give you 5 or 6 reasons for linking the book of Josiah with the book of Deuteronomy, which I think is fair, right? I think there's a good case to be made that what they found is what certainly included the book of Deuteronomy, because there's things like the destruction of the Canaanite high places, which occurs in Josiah's reforms, which is prescribed in Deuteronomy 12. Or you have worshiping at a central sanctuary. That's prescribed by Josiah, and that's also prescribed in Deuteronomy. You have other things like prohibitions against going to diviners, mediums, spiritists who contact ancestors who have passed on, and you're not supposed to do that. Josiah doesn't like that, and the book of Deuteronomy doesn't like that. Or a so-called name theology, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit, shows up in Josiah and also in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, when it comes to liberal scholarship, what happens in the 19th and the 20th century is that you have mostly German scholars saying that what was found in the book of, Josiah didn't find the book of Deuteronomy. It was during his reign that the book of Deuteronomy was created. So they didn't actually find anything. They created it, and then it's sort of, I don't know, as propaganda or public relations, it was said to have been found, but actually it was written. And there's a lot of scholarship devoted to this, and I read a lot of this myself, reading folks like Alt and von Rath and Weinfeld and Alter and others. There's a whole Deuteronomic scholarship out there where these theories become sort of elaborate and and it can be persuasive if you read them long enough. Myself, I've become disenchanted with this line of reasoning in that it's very speculative, right? There's no hard evidence for this. They look at the text and they try to explain changes in style and vocabulary and things like this, and it's tied in with source criticism and a skeptical view of the Bible as a historical source, and so they come up with this theory. There are folks who argue against this, and they say that the historical background for the book of Deuteronomy is really close to the time of Moses, and this is the third point under historical background here. And there's a woman named Meredith Kline back in the 60s who wrote an important work on the book of Deuteronomy, and she made the case that when you look at the covenant formula that's used in the book of Deuteronomy, it looks a lot like Hittite covenant formulas, and it looks less like Assyrian covenant formulas. So the Bible wasn't written in a vacuum, and it's useful to study the literature of its neighbors, and the covenant or the contract that we see in the book of Deuteronomy looks a lot like the Hittite covenant formula, which comes from the time of the historical Moses, right? It comes from the 2nd millennium BC, back before the Iron Age, back in the Bronze Age. And so that's an argument for pushing the book of Deuteronomy back to a 2nd millennium time period. The Assyrian covenant formula, and this would be technically the Neo-Assyrians. The Neo-Assyrians come from the 8th century or the 7th century BC. The Neo-Assyrians were responsible for destroying the northern kingdom, which fell in 722, as you might recall. So a few hundred years later is when the Assyrians were doing their thing. And you can compare and contrast what you find in the book of Deuteronomy with these different covenant formulas. And the book of Deuteronomy looks like this older way of doing things. And so that there's an argument to be made for that. Walton has a really handy, in his book of charts, which I've shared with you a couple of times, he has a really handy comparison of this, and I have a couple of more charts for you on source criticism and this covenant formula that I can share with you this week, and you can see how they're similar and how they're different from that chart. So anyway, that's one argument for placing the book of Deuteronomy back into the 2nd millennium BC, back close to the time of Moses. Okay, moving on. The literary structure, and so the literary structure that is here on the slide comes from your textbook, and it simply spells out that Hittite covenant formula, just to keep things simple for an exam down the road. I've consolidated the first 2 points, preamble and historical prologue, into simply prologue 1 through 3, but there are, in that Hittite covenant formula and in the book of Deuteronomy, there are really 2 sections there, and they do parallel each other. So you have this prologue and sort of setting up the covenant, and then you have chapter 4 through 26, you have all of these stipulations, both basic and started off with basic stipulations and then detailed stipulations. What are the expected behaviors for the vassals in respect to the suzerain, or the Israelites with respect to God? What are the expected behavior? What are the stipulations? This then is followed by curses and blessings. Of course, this would be a negative or a positive response from the suzerain or the king. And of course here that would be God, the heavenly king. So doing good things results in a good response from God, a blessing. So good things happen to good people. Or curses, if you do something bad, that results in a curse. So bad things happen to bad people. Incidentally, this is called traditional wisdom. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. And the Bible has a lot of traditional wisdom in it. Eventually, we'll get to non-traditional wisdom, like the book of Job, where bad things happen to good people. Or the book of Ecclesiastes, where it talks about how the rain falls on the wicked as well as the good. So anyway, you have these curses and blessings. 4 chapters of those, and then that is followed by succession arrangements. You have the invocation of witnesses, which is followed by a provision of public reading, and that ends the book of Deuteronomy in terms of its structure. Now, theology, Deuteronomy is full of theology, and some people really view it as the start of a theological school. So we mentioned liberal scholarship for the historical background. There's some people who think that there was a Deuteronomic school or Deuteronomistic school that grows up around the book of Deuteronomy, and then these folks continued to write, namely the succeeding books of the Bible, Joshua through Kings, because it was so theologically important. But anyway, there's the so-called name theology or shame theology. Shame in Hebrew is the word for name, and you can do a simple search on shame in the book of Deuteronomy, and you'll find all sorts of interesting passages. Your textbook quotes from the Amarna letters, getting at an ancient Near Eastern view of name. And I'm reading from the bottom of 115. A similar expression is found twice in the Amarna letters from the second half of the second millennium BC. King Abdu-Heba set his name in the land of Jerusalem. This expression suggests both ownership and conquest. For God to place his name on a place or nation is also to imply his ownership. And of course, in Hebrew, or in the Israelite worldview and Old Testament theology, names are very important. The name of God is very important. How it's revealed to Moses, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I will be what I will be. This is, of course, the root etymology of the name Yahweh. And of course, knowing God's name and being able to call upon God's name and invoke God's name in a blessing or a curse is a very powerful thing. Or for God to change your name is a very powerful thing. And so you see this also in the book of Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy 12:11, let me just flip over there real quick. Sorry, it's not Deuteronomy 12, but Deuteronomy, it's not 12:11, it's 12:5. Instead, turn to the place the Lord your God chooses from all your tribes to put his name for his dwelling place, and go there. No, actually Deuteronomy 12:11 too, I see here. Then the Lord your God will choose the place to have his name dwell. Of course, this is looking forward to a time of centralized worship where everyone will worship in the place where his name dwells, namely Jerusalem. And so you have sort of this name theology. Also in Deuteronomy, and these two are related, as you can see from the verse I just read, is this idea of centralization of worship. And you've got over a dozen references to this in the book of Deuteronomy, right? The people looking forward to a time where they will all worship together in one place, right? And so this means during times of festivals, you would travel to this central location, which becomes Jerusalem, and you will worship there, the 12 tribes gathering together. So those just two, central theological pieces to Deuteronomy. Looking forward to the New Testament, Deuteronomy is very important. You know, if you have, and I think at Bethel it's still common for folks to get the UBS critical edition of the New Testament. In terms of their Old Testament quotations, their index in the back is fantastic. I know Nestle Allen has one as well, but the one in the back of the UBS is really handy. And I just did a quick count of from the Old Testament order arrangement of the quotations. You know, there's over 50 quotations of the book of Deuteronomy in the New Testament, and so that's one of the top quoted books. Then you can look through the rest of the list for yourself, and you can see that, you know, the book of Psalms and the book of Isaiah are quoted more than Deuteronomy, but it's right up there. I think it might be in third place, just from my, you know, eyeballing this list. So it's quoted quite a bit. Incidentally, the book of Deuteronomy is also one of the most popular books at among the Dead Sea Scrolls, among Qumran's documents. So within the history of interpretation, within Judaism and within Christianity, Deuteronomy is very, very important. The Shema is, well, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. And this is, Hear, O Israel, of the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Within the Shema, you have this idea that there is one God and one land and one place of worship and one nation, and this becomes this very powerful idea. And you see this in the New Testament as well, right? Jesus talks about how we become united with each other. He talks about how he and the Father are one. Anyway, so the Shema. Also, another theological idea I see within the New Testament reflected in Deuteronomy would be Jesus as the new Moses. So if you consider the Sermon on the Mount, right, what is Jesus doing? He's on top of a mountain. And if you look at those chapters in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Jesus is interpreting the law. He says, you have heard this, or it has been written this, but I say to you this. And so Jesus is on top of the mountain giving a new law to the people, right? So there you have Jesus as the new Moses, interpreting the law to them. So anyway, there are just some brief thoughts on the book of Deuteronomy that hopefully are useful to you. I hope you guys are all doing well, and we will talk to you later. Take care.